welcome. It's so great that you guys are here, even in this horrible weather. We're eternally grateful. For those of you who have not heard me say this, Writers Speak Wednesdays is now on Facebook, and it would be really great for us if you would like us so that we can monitor your liking. The same is true for the Southampton Review. Our submission period is now open and will be open until November 1st, so if you are interested in submitting, now's the time. We have a tradition here at the college of doing very brief introductions for our wonderful visiting authors, but in the case of Betsy Carter, she's done so many things that I just have to list them because she's not only a novelist, she's a memoirist, a magazine founder, a wonderful editor. She can and has done pretty much everything that anybody can do in this business, and so she's kind of an exemplar of everything that we all strive to be. The magazine that she founded, New York Woman, was the defining magazine of a particular period in the magazine world, probably the best period. And her memoir, Nothing to Fall Back On, was a national bestseller. And tonight she's going to read to us from her wonderful new novel, The Puzzle King. So.
Thank you, Susie. That was lovely. I'm going to talk a little bit first, though. I grew up thinking that my great-uncle invented Monopoly. I was the youngest daughter of German Jewish immigrants who came over here during the war, and I guess I was sort of a product of them reinventing themselves in America. So for many years, I got their version. I'm going to take these off because they clank. I got their version of America and their version of sort of how we grew up in America. And I think that must be a reason that I became a journalist. I spent 30 years, as Susie said. I was a reporter. I edited about 6 magazines. I founded 2 magazines. I wrote 3 novels and a memoir before I actually took a moment to look at my own life and think, wait a minute, who were all these people and how did I get here and how did I get to America? And the first thing I discovered when I started researching my background was that my great-uncle did not invent Monopoly. This was a big shock to me. My great-uncle did invent the way to do jigsaw puzzles and make them out of paper instead of wood. He came over as a young boy from Lithuania. He started in what they called the show card business, which is really, I guess, pre-advertising. These were these cards that would say, buy your shoes at Digby's, and they'd show a pretty girl with a basket of flowers wearing shoes. And then he worked in the advertising business, and apparently he was asked one year to do a premium for Pepsodent toothpaste, and a premium is something that you give away, and he thought about what would be free, what would be cheap to do, and he figured out how to do a cardboard puzzle of a little girl brushing her teeth while this bull terrier sort of, was yapping up and down and jumping up and around her. And he gave this premium away. Pepsodent toothpaste suddenly sold like 1 million copies. Sold out 1 million copies of this. And he began to manufacture puzzles. He began to manufacture paper puzzles. Now, this was during the Depression. And during the Depression, nobody could afford to go to movies or theater. And so at-home activities were the things that people really did, and these puzzles just caught on like wildfire. Time magazine named him the Puzzle King, and he became a millionaire. He was married to a very, very beautiful woman. Her name was Flora. Flora was originally from Germany, but left as a young girl, left her family in Germany, came to America, and they got married. He was not the most attractive man. He was a little man and kind of an owlish face, and always sort of, as I found out later, used to say to him, this is like God's joke that I would end up with this beautiful woman. So this is what I found as I was researching, and then I started to wonder, what else didn't I know? And I knew that these people were responsible for getting my parents out of Germany, and they were also responsible, I knew, for getting hundreds of people out of Germany, but that was all I knew. So I started beginning to research, and I decided that I wanted to write a novel about this man and this woman, but I decided to write a book about them, and I had to write a novel because A, none of the people involved in the story, including my parents, were living at the time, and B, I changed their story a little bit because I wanted to show, I based this novel from 1892 to 1936, and it takes place in Kaiserslautern, Germany, which is a small town in the southwest part of Germany, and New York City, and it goes back and forth. And what I try to show in this novel is sort of the burgeoning anti-Semitism in America and also in Europe, and also how Germans, particularly Germans, because this was my story, were really intransigent and didn't really want to face what was happening in that country. So what I started with was I had one photograph of Simon and Flora. His real name was Morris, but for some reason I decided to call him Simon in the novel. This photograph was a bit of a distance, but I could see that he was indeed a small, owlish-looking, very serious man, and I kind of had this feeling just from looking at him that he was full of moral character, but more on that later. And Flora was this beautiful, very larger-than-life woman who, these pictures I had to think were taken somewhere in the 30s, was wearing a very festive hat, and I knew that she was a fashion-conscious woman from my sister who had remembered her. She was wearing a suit, and she was wearing these wonderful shoes, and I had this picture, and I studied this picture, and I studied these picture, and I just kind of got to know them through this picture. The second thing I did was I found his obituary at the New York Times, and that really gave me a couple of guideposts to use about his story. One of the stories that was so fascinating was that he came to America as a young boy, had no education, but had a real artistic flair and could draw, which very beautiful graphic drawings. And there was a heavyweight fight in 1897 between Bob Fitzsimmons and James Corbett. And at that time, of course, there was no radio, there was no television, and so the fight was coming over through the telegraph, and people were gathering around as Morris Einstein was drawing the fight on the sidewalk, and he drew the knockout punch apparently so vividly that somebody bought it for a bit of money at that time and said, I will make this into a poster, and it was really what began his graphic arts career. So I found that out in the obituary. The next thing I did was I tracked down a woman named Anne Williams, who is America's foremost expert on puzzles. She was at Bates College, and she was very excited when I told her that I wanted to write a book about this guy because she knew more about him than anyone else. And she explained to me what his contribution was, and that is that he invented something called the die cut, which until he came along, wooden puzzles were cut by hand, which means that they took a very long time to produce. They were very expensive to produce, and nobody could really afford them. The die cut was basically a big electric saw that he would draw the pieces, and you could cut 100 of them at a time, and obviously that cuts your cost and made them cheap to produce. She also gave me a lot of trade journals, so I was able to, in the book, I hope, properly discuss his career. I then discovered that I went and you can look up patents and get copies of patents. I found 75 patents that he had done as an advertising executive. In fact, he did the first robot. It was he did window displays, and this was a robot that shaved itself, and it was really apparently America's first robot, and he did masks with advertising on it. So I found his drawings, I found his handwriting, and he started to come alive to me in that way. The next thing I did while I was writing, I kept reading Time magazine for the years I was writing, and it was an interesting exercise because I would really focus on what was going on in Europe and what was going on in the war. And as Time magazine at that time, and I think it's changed quite a bit since, but they were very flip about what was going on in Europe and what was going on with Hitler and what was going on with Goebbels, and they had nicknames for all of them. And it was really not until quite late, as things were getting quite horrible in Germany, that they started to take it seriously and they started not to use the nicknames. I went to, there's an institute in New York City called YIVO, which is, it's a lot of Jewish studies, and it had a lot of letters from people requesting Americans to file the very essential affidavits of support, which were letters that Americans sent over guaranteeing that they would vouchsafe for any immigrant that was coming over from Europe so that they wouldn't be a burden to the American government. So in other words, if somebody was coming over from Germany and they didn't have a job, this person would guarantee that they would support them. And that figures very much in my story, because what they did, in fact, in a very dramatic way, which unfolds in the book, is they guaranteed more than a couple of hundred people, which saved a couple of hundred people coming out of Germany. The characters in the book are Flora, who is, I kept her pretty much as she was. The difference was in the book, I gave her no children because Flora's family is still in the book. They're still in Germany, and she's the only one here. And the book is a lot about her attempt to get them out of Germany. Simon's family is lost in Lithuania, and despite his wealth and success and everything wonderful that happened to him, he cannot find his family. And the book is a lot about their quest to find these people. I gave Flora two sisters. She had a sister named Sima, who was so beautiful they called her Seamless, and she was Jewish but really preferred not to be Jewish and really preferred the blue-eyed college boys. And what happens to Sima is a long story, but I can tell you, I'll just skip a little bit to the end. She ends up going back to Germany. Then there's Margaret, another sister whom I'm going to read you about in a moment. Margaret stays in Germany, is married to a man named Friedrich. Friedrich is a butcher. Friedrich served in World War I on the Germany side and refuses to believe that anything is going wrong in Germany. And he's a German, and they're not going to hurt him, and he is steadfast about not leaving. They have a daughter named Edith. Edith is completely based on my mother, and she marries a man named Werner, who is completely based on my father. And during my research, my parents did come from the town of Kaiserslautern, and they got married in this very, I've seen pictures of it, this beautiful kind of Byzantine synagogue in Kaiserslautern. And it was the last Jewish wedding at the synagogue, which is why I think we had never had any pictures. I never know what she wore. I just never knew anything about this wedding. I think it was done very quickly. And when I was doing my research and I wanted to write the wedding scene for this book, I somehow got onto a German website about synagogues that were destroyed during the Holocaust, and lo and behold, found not only the synagogue, but the interior of the synagogue where they had been married. So it was kind of I can't say that writing is usually transporting, but it was a transporting moment to be able to act out their wedding and write out their wedding and see what his face looked like when she walked down the aisle. I wrote, as Susie said, I wrote a memoir in about 2000 called Nothing to Fall Back On, and a lot of it was, I'd had a pretty dark spell, and it was a lot about dealing with life and things that life hits you with, and that was it. I put it to rest. And then when I worked on this novel, I realized that I came from a family of kind of tough stuff, and it gave me some sort of it put things in perspective and made me think differently about what had happened to me and what I had come from. And it was in that way, it was a very kind of a strengthening thing to do. And now I'd like to read you just a couple of passages from this book. And as I said, this book goes back and forth, Germany and New York. In this chapter, Simon still hasn't found his family, who he's left behind in Vilna. And this chapter takes place in Coney Island in April of 1923. The seagulls flew along the horizon and were nearly indistinguishable from the flock of clouds that scuttered across the sky. "Those birds, they're so loud and angry," said Flora. "What's all the fuss about?" "Food, territory, pecking order, what's it ever about?" said Simon. It was the first temperate day of spring, a Saturday. Flora and Simon, as they did every year at this time, marked the change of season by a drive down to the beach at Coney Island. She looked smart in her summer navy blue suit, a pair of spectator heels, and a new plum-colored hat with white petals. He looked distinguished in his gray double-breasted light wool coat and felt fedora. They nodded at the other couples strolling the boardwalk that day, all of them infused with the promise of spring. They watched the pelicans, eyes closed and chests puffed, as they perched on pilings and let the sun bathe over them. When Flora and Simon came to a nearby bench facing the ocean, they sat down and pretty much did the same as the birds. The sun seeped through their clothes and warmed their bones, which had become weary with the cold winter months and the worries they carried. Simon let his head drop against Flora's shoulder and fell into a half-sleep. Her softness became his mother's arms. She was covering him with blankets so gently it was as if the lapping sea were embracing him. Flora placed his fedora in her lap and kissed the top of his head. He smelled like camphor and brine. She noticed his graying sideburns and how his hair was thinning on the top. He was only 40, still a young man. The thought that they could have 40 more years together, that she would be there when his hair was white and the top of his head bald and smooth, settled over her and made the world seem smaller and safer than it had in a long while. The sky suddenly became overcast and the air chilly. Simon woke abruptly as if someone had snatched away his blankets. They sat on the bench, staring out at the ocean when they caught sight of some boys on the shore. They were laughing, throwing stones at the gulls who were still stirring up a ruckus. Flora thought she saw one of the stones nick one of the gull's wings, but she couldn't be sure. All she said to Simon was, "I wish those boys would quit doing that." He took her arm and they left the bench, continuing their stroll down the boardwalk at a slightly brisker pace. When the wind stirred up and the sky got molten, they decided to turn around and head back. As they neared the bench where they'd be sitting, Simon was first to notice the gull. The other birds were gone now, and his solo cry sounded plaintive as he spiraled toward the water. One of his wings was outstretched like a leg in a cast. The wing was first to hit the water, and he landed gently as if in a parachute. Flora saw what Simon was seeing, and the two of them stood on the boardwalk speechless and helpless. The gull was silent too. He kept turning his head to look at his broken wing, opening and closing his orange beak as if with disbelief. Gamely, he tried to lift himself out of the water, but his flapping became weaker. He was beginning to list to one side. "Stupid kids," shouted Flora, turning away. But the boys were well out of earshot, way down the shore, still throwing stones at the sky. They had hit their mark here, and they didn't even know it. Simon kept staring out at the water. "Make them stop," cried Flora, so agitated that she was walking in circles. "We should do something." Simon buttoned up his jacket, turned up his collar. "You're right, we should do something," he said, as he watched the gull sink out of sight. Now, we're going to skip ahead. We're now in Kaiserslautern. It's the winter of 1934. As I said, Flora's sister, Margaret, is still in Germany with her husband, Friedrich, who's a butcher, and she cannot convince them to come to America. Margaret is sort of seeing what's happening and is getting more and more upset about what's happening around her. So this is Kaiserslautern, winter 1934. After her mother died, Margaret suffered dizzy spells. Nervous exhaustion, the doctor had said. It was to be expected. But lately she was experiencing something far more frightening. It started 2 weeks after New Year's. Friedrich had come home from work one night, pale and hunched over as if he'd just been slugged in the stomach. "What's wrong?" she cried as he fell into a chair. "It's nothing, nothing to worry about," he said. She knelt down next to him. "You're trembling." He turned his face away, but not before she'd noticed the tears. She lay her cheek on his knees. "My sweet Friedrich, what is it? What is so horrible?" He took a deep breath. In a strangled voice, he told her what had happened. "Ernst Licht, you remember him? Fat with the mustache and beard? We worked together until he opened his own store 5 years ago. Yesterday morning, he's in his shop. A man comes in and asks for kosher brisket. So what does he do? He goes and prepares it for him, 3 days after the government said there would be no kosher meat prepared in Germany." Friedrich never raised his voice, but now he was nearly shouting. "We were all warned about this. Licht knew, stubborn old fool. Of course, the customer turned out to be a member of the government." Just like that, they closed down his shop. This morning, his wife wakes up. He's gone, can't find him. She goes into the backyard. There he is, hanging from a tree, hanging, neck broken, head resting on his own shoulder like he's napping. He hanged himself. Friedrich shuddered and began to sob. Can you imagine? Come, said Margaret, beckoning him to sit next to her. He slid off the chair and onto the floor, where she put her arm around him and nudged his head into her breast. She rocked back and forth, until she could feel his body slacken. When he was quiet, he sat up and patted her on the shoulder. I'm sorry I let my tongue run on so, he said, trying to push the horror aside and assume his normal voice. The times in which we live. He paused and shook his head. Thank God we have each other, right, Liebchen? A week later, Margaret was sweeping the floor as she did every evening, when suddenly it seemed to give way beneath her. If she hadn't grabbed onto the nearby table, she was certain she would have fallen. Then, on a Sunday morning in February, she went out for one of her walks. Fresh snow made the trees look white and ghostly. The closer she got to the trees, the more make-believe they seemed. Maybe they weren't there at all. She would touch them to find out. She wrapped her arms around one of them. It seemed substantial, but wait, the house. She was sure if she touched it, it would be like stroking air. She ran over to it and rubbed her hands up and down the cold stucco. She watched her arms move along the wall. The house seemed to be there. Then a greater panic set in. Her arms were disappearing. She pulled up her sleeve and licked her forearm like a dog, desperate that the taste of her own salty flesh bring her back to reality. It was too late. She could feel herself slipping away. Friedrich, concerned that she'd been gone too long, went outside and found her lying in the snow. She was awake but confused and unsure of where she was. What happened? He cried. She told him about the tree and house. Then I felt as if the inside of me was emptying and I couldn't stop it. I was disappearing. That must be when I fainted. He carried her inside and took off her wet clothes. He tucked her in under the quilt and made her some tea. When he came back to her, he sat at the foot of her bed, head in hands, and listened as she talked. I'm so frightened. Nothing seems real to me. He rubbed the little mound on the quilt that was covering her feet. My poor, scared Margotchen, everything is real. No one is disappearing. Everyone is disappearing, she shouted. My mother, Ernst licked everyone. He shook his head. This is my fault. I should have never brought my worries into the house. I promise you are safe here. Friedrich, who is safe with anyone? I could kick myself for telling you about Ernst. It's one of these things that happens. An isolated incident, I'm certain. But in his heart, Friedrich knew that in these times, in this place, being certain was nothing to count on. 1 week later, Friedrich went to work at 7:30, as he had every morning for the past 16 years. His boss, Gustav Reinhardt, greeted him at the door. He spoke in a monotone as if reciting from a script. Good morning, Friedrich. I am sorry to inform you that this store, in accordance with the rules of the government, no longer employs Jews. He turned away from Friedrich as he said the word Jews. He was a short, pear-shaped man who managed to block the doorway. I've come to work here every day for 16 years, said Friedrich. Does that not count for anything, Gustav? Intentionally, Friedrich had chosen to address his boss informally, although up until now he had always called him Herr Reinhardt. Reinhardt's cheeks turned pink and his eyes darted away from Friedrich's. Please don't make this any harder, he said, moving aside so that Friedrich could pass. I am only doing what I must. You may gather your things. I have packed them up. You'll find them on your shelf in the back. When Friedrich went to retrieve his smock, his knives, and his knife sharpener, he found a large sack with his name on it. It was so heavy he could barely lift it. It gave off a familiar bloody odor, and Friedrich feared that Reinhardt had piled together a sack of bones in order to humiliate him further. But when he peered inside, he could see beautiful cuts of lamb and beef and pieces of chicken. He tried to catch Reinhardt's eye to thank him, but Reinhardt jerked his head and flicked his hand. Go now, he said quickly. Only when he got home did he discover that Reinhardt had also stuffed as many notes as he could between the breasts of chicken, loins of lamb, and shoulder cuts of beef. It was more money than he had ever seen in one place, and he figured enough to keep them going until well into the new year. You see, he said to Margaret, who was not able to speak when he gave her the news, they're not all bad. So this book came out about a year ago, and I don't know that I mentioned, but I don't have a very large family, and I'm sort of always seeking out families, other people to be my families. And the book came out, and I did some readings, and it got some notices and stuff, and I started hearing from people all over the country who were either vaguely related to me or who had been touched in some way by Simon and Flora or Morris and Flora's life. And in the book, Morris, I'm not going to tell you what happens to him, but he's a heroic man, and he really does try to do the right thing. And I had kind of made up his character as having this moral center, just again from the photographs and the little I could glean from what I read about him. But a year ago, somebody found me who knew Morris's family and somehow sent along this letter to me that his mother, who was alive, actually did survive the war, had written at the time of her death. And I want to read part of it to you because it was it was kind of a wonderful validation of the character I created, and also it so resonated with who I thought he was. So I'm just going to close by reading you parts of this letter. And this is from his mother to all of the children. My dear children, do not grieve. Your mother is not gone. She is still here with you and will live with you for many years in spirit and mind. My entire life has been a happy one with you all, and I want to thank God for blessing me with such wonderful children and to express joy that they have added to my happiness by bringing into our midst the fine husbands and wives you have chosen and the splendid children you have brought into this world. There are a few requests I should like to ask of you, and I ask you. I want my entrance into the life hereafter to be as simple and as plain as my entire life has been. No fuss, no trimmings. Please see I am laid to rest in a plain wooden box from my home in my own burial clothes. I want the plainest of plain Orthodox funerals to be paid from my money. Whoever wishes to send flowers, please send that money to be given to the poor and the needy. I shall not rest comfortably with a big stone over my head. Please give me no such headache. I also ask of you all to carry on the work I have started and have tried so hard to uphold. Help the poor, and you will be comforted. Should, God forbid, pain or trouble come to any of you, take this little note, read it over. It will help you. You will see the glad sacrifices your mother has made for your welfare. It will give you new hope and strength. And now I wish you the greatest happiness and peace. I hope you will always be together in harmony, love one another, help one another, and carry on in great health. Remember, my dear children, I love you. Remember, I am with you always. And this is dated March 31st, 1932. So thank you very much. And I'm happy to answer. Put on the thank you bracelets. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. Yep.
I always have a question. That was wonderful, Betsy. Thank you. I'm curious, when you're writing, when you're shifting between your reportorial and researchy head into your fictional head, do you feel it? I mean, is there something in your process or where you shift, or do you know what I'm asking?
I understand what you're saying. I think it's the question is how I shift from the repertorial to the fiction, and
well, I mean, even in the process of writing this, that there were moments probably where you knew exactly what the facts on the ground were, and then you go into, feeling what it would be like to have your head rubbed or fall asleep in someone's lap, and, which you couldn't know.
Well, that I just drew from his character because he was so missed in the book. He so yearns for his mother and his family, so that was a natural part of his character. But the actual getting the facts, I mean, I read a lot of newspapers, and as I said, I read Time magazines, but what you get from that are facts. And so, for example, the scene where the butcher, the ordinance is passed down, no kosher meat shall be sold. Well, I read that. And then I envisioned, well, what would that be like if you were a butcher and you'd always been selling kosher meat and you'd lived there all your life? Would you stop selling it, or would you believe the ordinance? Would you keep selling it? So it was really, you take those facts, and then, because they're not peopled with adjectives or anecdotes, that's where you come in and say, well, what would that be like? What would that be like to be there and have that rule imposed on me? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Does that answer it?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm sort of wondering whether there's a kind of a physiological moment where you lift off and you're fictional, like a thing or something. I don't know. I
like stories. I like telling stories, and I guess these people, I mean, not everything in this book actually happened, and I used these people who I got to know through factual anecdotes or obituaries or whatever. I used them to then kind of tell a story, and that's where I lifted off, although I didn't really lift off that much. It's kind of sat down, but that's where you take off and you embody their emotional lives, which I can't have known what they were like, which was why this letter pleased me so, because it was so in keeping with who I thought he might have been, but I really didn't know, so that's what I thought. Yes?
These characters who are related to you are complementary and so forth, but I'm sure in your writings you pulled out experiences, people you know, and their acts are not so complementary. You know, they're doing bad things. How do you, as a writer, confront, you know, public perception, your family, your friends, that you're either writing about them or separated out, or, I mean, it's kind of a general question, but.
So in other words, how do I write negatively about people I'm related to or I've known? First of all, not everybody in this book does complimentary things. I can speak from experience, having written a memoir and saying very unflattering things about people that I'm related to and I've known very well. And I consider that one of the craziest things I've ever done, because that was naked. I mean, that was names and that was situations. At least in fiction, people think they always see themselves, and then you can say to them, oh, no, that wasn't you. That was a composite, or that was somebody else. So you can play out characters without ever revealing who the characters are, which is why I've actually enjoyed fiction more than nonfiction. You can play out people's bad behavior and mix it up so that you can't really pin it on any one person, and it's really kind of fun to do that. Does that answer that?
Yeah.
Yes.
I don't know if you can answer this, but do you think that the novel would have been different, or the memoir would have been different, if the order had been reversed?
Oh, that's a great question. That's a really good question. Yeah, I do, and I'll tell you why. Because my parents they had accents, and our house was filled with this very heavy German furniture that they were able to bring over in what they called the lift. You know, they were still able to bring things. I grew up in Miami at a time when Miami wasn't like Miami is now, and they were odd. My parents were odd, my house was odd, and the last thing I wanted to be was odd. And so I went in the other direction, and I was very American. You know, I just did everything American. I was a cheerleader. I was actually picked for my yearbook as the all-American girl. I mean, I really did everything I could do to break from this past. And as I said earlier, I think it's one of the reasons I became a journalist, because I didn't really want to get into my story, but I love getting into other people's stories. And honestly, until this story hit me when I started looking up this fellow Morris, that's the first time, and I mean, that was many years, 30 years later, into my adulthood, I mean, that I started thinking, wow, I have a story too. And I just think that had I written the memoir, the memoir is largely about, you know, my life and growing up in Miami and my professional life, which was very exciting, and then this string of horrors that had happened to me, and that was very exciting in a negative way. I think it would have been framed very differently had I known what I'd known when I wrote this. Oddly enough, as somebody who has tried to stay away from her past most of her life, I'm now working on another novel that has to do with people coming to America as strangers and what it's like to be a foreigner in this place. And again, it's not these people, but it is that theme that I have really tried to stay away from. I seem to be somewhat obsessed with now. So yes, that's a very good question. I think it would have been different. Yes?
Will you talk a little bit about the novels that preceded Puzzle King?
Okay. Well, there was the memoir first. I wrote a memoir first, which seems arrogant, but there were two reasons I wrote the memoir first. One is that I was having a hard time I probably was having somewhat post-traumatic stress syndrome from a various amount of things that had happened to me, and I thought if I ever wanted to write fiction, these episodes, a burning house, a terrible disease, a terrible car accident, etc., I'd keep writing about them in fiction. And I thought, get rid of them, write them, and you will never have to write about them again. And also, and it really was true. So I did get rid of them, and I got rid of a lot of characters in my life that I think I would have brought up again and again. So that was one reason to write the memoir first. Then the day, or pretty much right after I finished the memoir, I just thought, I'm never doing this again. I'm never writing a word about myself. I'm never writing the truth again. And I started to write a short story about, my husband and I had recently been on a bicycle trip, and we met this couple. He'd been a preacher in Florida, and he was a big, robust man, and she was this tiny little person, and he had just discovered he'd had a brain tumor, and he was slowly fading. And we stayed up, she and I one night stayed up very late, and she told me their whole story. And I started to write this as a short story. I wrote it as a short story, their story, and embellished him being this priest, this preacher in Florida, and this woman having to become his voice because he was losing his voice. And showed it to my agent, who said, I'd like to know more about these people. And that story became a novel called The Orange Blossom Special, which was really took place in Florida. A lot had to do with my growing up in Florida in the late 50s and 60s, and a lot of it is about what was going on with civil rights, and just capturing that whole, was when Disney was moving in and so on. That was the first novel, and then I wrote a second novel called Swim to Me, based on my obsession when I was a young girl growing up that I was going to become a water skier. I was a good water skier, and I thought our only family trip we'd ever taken was to Cypress Gardens, and I thought, that's it, I'm going to become a professional water skier. And I had finished writing the novel, and this was a couple of years ago. There was a front page piece in the New York Times about this place in Florida called Weeki Wachee. I don't know if anyone's ever heard of it, and they do live mermaid shows. And there was a picture on the front page of these young girls sitting on I have this at home, sitting on a tank with their little mermaid outfits, and they were about to close Weeki Wachee because they were having an issue with the water. They were basically contaminating the water of Weeki Wachee Springs, and they were going to close this last real Florida tourist attraction. And I started thinking about that, and I got myself a magazine assignment to go down and do the story on Weeki Wachee, and I met so many mermaids and became really interested in the mermaids and put it together with my obsession about becoming a water skier, and wrote a novel about a young girl from New York City who parents get divorced, they don't have a lot of money, the only thing this girl knows how to do is swim. She's a wonderful swimmer. She, unbeknownst to her mother, applies to become a mermaid in Weeki Wachee, gets accepted, goes down to Weeki Wachee, becomes a professional mermaid, then becomes a weather girl on TV, and it's a coming-of-age story about this girl. And this book was also based on what happened when it was right when Disney was coming into Florida, and it was right. I was very interested in the time that Florida went from the sort of small southern place to a very commercial Disney place, and that's what Swim to Me is about. And now I'm writing about, people who are displaced and coming to a foreign country or a foreign city, and what's that like.
So that was absolutely wonderful. Would you like to sign some books?
Sure.
Some books?
Thank you very much.
So much.